Virgin against the arrogant EO's rules. No underwear when you are with me. Part 2. It started with a storm. Not metaphorically, though later, when Nora had the distance to look back at the fifth week, she would think that the weather had been almost too on the nose. An actual storm. The kind that rolled in off the Atlantic on a Thursday evening in October, with the quiet menace of something that had been building for days, and announced itself finally with a crack of thunder that rattled the penthouse windows and turned the city below into a smeared watercolor of light and rain. The power went out at 8:47. Not the whole penthouse. The building's generator caught it within seconds, brought the essential systems back online. But the lights dimmed to emergency levels. The city outside disappeared behind a wall of rain, and the penthouse became a different place entirely. Smaller, closer, and the sharp architectural edges softened by low amber emergency lighting. The usual hum of climate control and technology quieted to something almost like silence. Nora had been in the kitchen finishing the dinner dishes when it happened. She stood still for a moment in the dim light, water still running over her hands, listening to the rain assault the windows with a kind of intensity that felt personal. Then she turned off the tap and went to find candles. She found them in the third cabinet she tried. Tall white ones, good quality, clearly purchased by someone with aesthetic standards and never used. She found matches beside them. She carried both to the living room, which was the largest space and had the best window view of the storm, and began lighting them on the low table and the mantel and the wide windowsill. She was on the fourth candle when she heard him behind her. "Power's on the generator," he said. "I know." She lit the fifth. "Picking candles are better." A pause. He came further into the room. She could hear it in the quality of the silence, the way it changed when he entered a space, that particular gravitational shift she had stopped pretending she didn't notice. "You could have just left the overheads," he said. "The overheads are ugly in a storm." She sat back on her heels and looked at the row of candles on the windowsill, the rain streaming down the glass behind them, the city a ghost of itself beyond. My grandmother used to light candles whenever the power went out back home. She said electricity was a convenience, but candlelight was a choice." She paused. "I always thought that was a little dramatic for Clover Falls, Ohio." But she wasn't wrong. She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the room, still in his work clothes. Dark trousers, white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow the way they always were by evening. And he was looking at the candles on the windowsill with an expression she had never seen on him. Not the careful blankness, not the assessment, not the shadow of almost a smile. Something open, something that had gotten out before he could file it away. "Sit down," she said, because it came out before she thought about it. "I'll make tea." He looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She was already moving toward the kitchen. "Sit down, Dominic." His name in her mouth. She had started using it. He'd corrected her 3 times in the first week, and she'd surrendered to it not because he'd insisted, but because Mr. Kane had started feeling like a wall she was helping him build. She used it carefully, deliberately, like something she'd borrowed and wasn't sure she was allowed to keep. When she came back with 2 mugs, he was sitting on the floor, not on the sofa, not in the chair, on the floor with his back against the sofa, facing the window in the storm. His jacket gone, shoes off, looking for the first time since she'd arrived, like a man who lived in his own home. She sat down beside him, not close, appropriate distance, the distance of 2 people who were being careful, and handed him the mug. He took it without looking at her. They watched the storm for a while. "How long have you been doing it?" she asked eventually. "Doing what?" "The rules." She kept her eyes on the rain. "The coordinator rules, the conduct clauses, and our running people off before they get comfortable." The silence stretched out long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. She'd gotten used to his silences, learned to read them the way you learn to read weather. This one had a particular quality. Not cold, not dismissive, careful. "Since I was 26, he said. She waited. He turned the mug in his hands, a slow rotation, something to do with his fingers. "I had a personal assistant, Mara. She was efficient, perceptive. She had been with me for 2 years when I realized she knew me better than anyone alive." He paused. I had told her things I hadn't told anyone else. Not intentionally. It accumulates when someone is in your space every day. Little pieces. The way you take your coffee. What you avoid talking about. What you look like when something has actually bothered you versus what you look like when you're performing being bothered. Nora was very still. And then she left, he said. New offer. A better position, entirely reasonable. She gave me 3 weeks' notice and was professional throughout. He set the mug down on the floor. And I realized that I had handed someone the entire architecture of who I was, quietly, without deciding to, just through proximity, and she had walked out the door with it like it was nothing. A pause. Because to her, it was nothing. To her, it was just a job. The rain streaked the windows. So you built the rule, Nora said quietly. Dear, I built a filter, he said. Something immediate and uncomfortable enough that the wrong people would leave before they could. He stopped. Before they could get close enough to leave with something that mattered, she finished. He looked at her then, directly, fully, the way he rarely allowed himself to. The candlelight was doing something specific to his face, softening the architecture of it, making visible the thing he spent considerable energy keeping invisible. He looked in this light, and in this moment, tired, not sleepy, tired. The kind of tired that had nothing to do with rest. Something like that, he said. Nora looked at her tea. I get it, she said. Not the rule specifically, but the logic of it. Protecting yourself by making yourself hard to reach. She paused. My dad left when I was 16. My mom didn't fall apart, which I always thought was strength. It took me until I was 20 to understand she just got very good at making herself hard to reach. Hosh too? She glanced at him sideways. It's efficient, but it's also lonely. He held her gaze. Yes, he said, simply, without armor. Just yes. Nora felt something shift in her chest. Not the slow, ignorable warmth of the past few weeks, but something sharper. A click. The feeling of a lock opening on something she had not consciously known was closed. She looked back at the window. Can I tell you something? She said. Yes. The rule. She kept her voice even. Practical. Her mother's daughter. Hey, when I first found it, when I was standing in your entryway holding page 12, I thought it was about power, about you asserting control over someone who couldn't push back. She paused. I was angry. Quietly, very thoroughly angry. I know, he said. She looked at him. You know? You asked me why. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. No one who was simply complying asked why. You were furious. You just had too much self-possession to perform it.
If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing you more amazing love stories. All right, back to the story.
Stared at him. Wait, you have been paying attention, she said. Since the first evening, he said quietly. The storm pressed against the windows. The candles flickered. Somewhere in the building, the generator hummed its steady, indifferent note. Nora became aware, with the slow certainty of something that had been true for a while before she was willing to see it, that the distance between them on the floor was smaller than it had been when she sat down. Neither of them had moved, or they had both moved. He gradually, in the way of things that happen when no one is watching closely enough to stop them. I should tell you something too, he said. She waited. The addendum on your copy. He looked at his hands. The others, the 4 before you, received it in the original contract. Pre-printed, standardized. And mine? Yours was handwritten. He paused. Added the night before you arrived. She processed this slowly. Why? He picked up his mug again. Because your CV landed on my desk and I read it and He stopped. Tried again. You drove 400 miles to interview in person because you couldn't afford the flight. You listed rebuilt the filing system for a 3-person law office without being asked as a professional achievement. You wrote your cover letter in a way that was... He exhaled once. You were going to be impossible to ignore. I knew it before you arrived. The addendum was... A filter, she said softly. Yes. To make me leave before I could... Yes. She sat with this. A man who had spent years constructing distance had looked at her resume. her modest, earnest, small-town resume, and had been frightened enough to add a handwritten rule before she'd even walked through the door. It should have made her angry. Sitting here on the floor in the candlelight, with the storm outside and his voice still settling into the room, it did not make her angry. It made something in her chest ache with the particular tenderness of recognizing a wound in someone else, because you carry a version of it yourself. It didn't work, she said. No, he said. It didn't. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. Close, genuinely close now, the careful distance entirely dissolved, and she could see the exact moment he became aware of it, because something shifted in his eyes. Not retreat, just awareness. His hand was on the floor between them. Hers was 6 inches away. Neither of them moved. The rain was softer now, still steady but no longer furious, the storm expending itself gradually, the way storms did when they had said what they came to say. Dominic, she said quietly. Don't, he said, not harshly, almost gently. Not yet. She understood. She did. Some things needed more time to be true out loud than they needed to be true. She nodded. She looked back at the window. After a moment, his hand slid 2 inches across the floor and his little finger rested, barely against hers. Not a hold, not a gesture with a name, just contact, just the faint warmth of it. She didn't move away. They sat like that until the storm passed. Two people who had each spent years building walls, sitting on the floor of a candlelit room with their pinkies barely touching, not talking about what it meant. It was the most honest either of them had been in a very long time. And he walked her to the door of the library at midnight. She'd wanted to finish one more chapter before bed, and paused in the doorway while she went to retrieve her book. When she turned around, he was watching her with an expression she had no name for, but that she felt, somehow, in the back of her sternum. Nora, he said. It was the first time he had used her first name. Not Miss Calloway, not the Calloway girl as Marcus called her, not the careful professional distance of surnames. Nora. In his voice, precise and quiet and deliberate, it sounded like something he had decided to say, rather than something that had slipped out. Something chosen. She looked at him. Good night, he said, and turned and walked away before she could respond. She stood in the library doorway, book pressed to her chest, and listened to his footsteps disappear down the hall. Then she sat in her chair and opened to her page and read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a single word. He added the rule because she frightened him before she arrived. She stayed because of her sister. They ended up on the floor in a storm with their pinkies barely touching, and somehow that was the most either of them had given another person in years. He said her name, just her name, and it was everything. The morning after the storm, everything was the same. That was the thing about penthouse life at 40 floors. Storms happened below you, around you, and then they were gone. And the marble floors were still marble, and the schedule was still the schedule. And Dominic Kane still emerged from his morning run at 6:15 with the same contained, deliberate energy he brought to every morning. And the city outside was washed clean and glittering and entirely indifferent to what had happened on the living room floor the night before. Nora had coffee ready. He took it without looking at her. She told herself this was fine. It was fine for 4 days. 4 days of the routine holding steady. Coffee, breakfast, schedule management, dinner at 7. 4 days of the library in the evenings, reading in their respective chairs with the fire going and the city darkening outside. 4 days of conversation that was careful and interesting and warm in the specific way that things are warm when two people are both tending something delicate without discussing that they're tending it. His hand never found hers again. He didn't say her name. But there were other things. Small things that she cataloged without meaning to. The way he started leaving his office door open in the afternoons. It had always been closed before. The way he lingered at breakfast instead of taking his plate back to his desk. The way on Thursday evening he had looked up from his book and said unprompted, "There's a foundation gala on the 14th. You'll need to attend as my coordinator. Marcus will brief you on the guest list." And the way the word coordinator had landed with a particular flatness, as if it were a word he'd chosen carefully to replace a different one. She had said, "Of course," and he had looked at her for just a moment too long before looking back at his book. Fine. Everything was fine. They were finding a shape for this, whatever this was, and it was delicate and unspoken, and she was handling it with the practicality she handled everything. Until Friday. Friday arrived in the form of a phone call she wasn't meant to overhear. She had come back early from a building errand, dropping documents at the concierge desk, a 10-minute task, and had returned to find his office door open and his voice carrying into the hallway with a clarity that stopped her in the corridor before she could announce herself. "Don't start, Marcus." Marcus's voice through the phone speaker, slightly tinny. "I'm just saying what I'm seeing, Dom. You're different." The whole floor noticed. "You smiled at the Hargrove call on Wednesday." "I didn't smile. Chen from legal literally texted me to ask if you were unwell." "Marcus, is it the Calloway girl?" Silence. Nora's hand was flat against the hallway wall. She should walk away. She knew she should walk away. Her feet did not receive the instruction. "Dom." "She's an employee," Dominic said. His voice had changed. The warmth that had accumulated over the past 5 weeks, quiet, careful, who never performed, was gone. In its place was the voice from the entryway on the first day, flat, contained, a door shutting. "She has a 12-month contract. She's here for professional reasons. Whatever you think you're observing, I think I'm observing you actually letting someone in for the first time since—" "Don't. Dominic." "She's 23 years old." His voice was very quiet now, very precise. The way he was precise when something mattered enough to be dangerous. "She's from a small town. She came here for her family, not for—" "She has a life somewhere else, Marcus. A real one. With a mother and a sister in a place that knows her name." A pause. "She'll finish the contract and she'll go home. That's what the contract is for. That's what it has always been for." Nora did not breathe. "And if she doesn't want to go?" "She will." Not cruel, not cold, almost sad, in the way of a man who had made a decision he believed in and hated simultaneously. People always do." A pause. "You're going to pull back." "I'm going to be appropriate." "That's the same thing." "Goodbye, Marcus." The call ended. Nora stood in the hallway for a moment that lasted considerably longer than a moment, her hand still flat against the wall, the document folder still in her other hand, the concierge stamp still warm on the top page. She'll finish the contract and she'll go home. People always do. She walked back to her workstation. She sat down. She opened his afternoon schedule and reviewed it with the focused attention of someone performing normalcy for an audience of one. She was very good at it, the performing. She had learned it young, learned to be steady when things were unsteady, to be warm when warmth was what the room needed, to hold her own feelings in a back room and deal with them privately. Later, when they wouldn't cost anyone anything. She performed it at dinner that night, was present and conversational and asked about the Singapore account and listened to his answer with genuine interest because she was genuinely interested, which was the problem, which had always been the problem. He performed it too. She could see it now, with the clarity of the hallway still in her chest. The way he was precise rather than present. The way the open office door was closed again. The way he refilled his own water glass and not hers. Not because he had forgotten, but because he was recalibrating. Rebuilding the distance with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done it many times before. People always do. He believed it. That was the thing that sat in her chest like a stone. He wasn't being cruel. He was being careful. With her, in his way, trying to protect her from something he had already decided was inevitable. She looked at the candles between them. She thought about his little finger against hers in the storm. She thought about him saying Nora in the library doorway, as if the word were something he'd carried for a while before letting it out. She picked up her fork and said, "The gala on the 14th. Marcus mentioned the dress code is black tie. Should I expense a dress or—" "Expense it," he said. "Helena has a preferred boutique. She'll arrange it." "Thank you." "Of course. Of course." Back to of courses. Back to clean, professional, appropriate distances. She ate her dinner. She went to the library afterward and sat in her chair and did not take out her book. She sat and looked at the fire and allowed herself, in the privacy of a room he hadn't entered yet, to feel the full weight of what she'd heard. Not anger. She'd moved through the brief pulse of anger quickly. It wasn't his fault that he'd said it, and she couldn't be angry at a man for believing something that his entire adult life had apparently confirmed. People left. That was his evidence. She couldn't fault him his evidence. What she felt, sitting with the fire and the empty chair across from her, was something quieter and more complicated. She felt the specific grief of something that had been building in candlelight and library evenings and sparkling water with lime and a pinky finger barely touching. Something real and fragile and genuinely mutual. She had not imagined it. She knew she had not imagined it. Being carefully, who deliberately dismantled by the person who had built it alongside her. Because he was afraid. Because he had decided the ending before the middle was finished. She pressed her fingers against her sternum, just briefly, just for a moment. Then she straightened. Practical. Her mother's daughter. She was here for 11 more months and she had a job to do and a sister's tuition to earn, and she was not going to fall apart in a man's library over the ghost of something that had never technically been named. She picked up her book. She read exactly one page before she heard his footsteps in the hall. They slowed outside the library. Stopped. She kept her eyes on the page. The footsteps moved on. The following week was the quietest the penthouse had ever been. He was not unkind. And that was the precision of his particular brand of retreat. He was never unkind, never cold in the way that would have been easier to be angry at. He was appropriate, professionally warm, attentive to her work, which was excellent, and to her needs as an employee, which were modest. He answered her questions and reviewed her schedule adjustments and ate the dinners she cooked with the same quiet appreciation as always. He just wasn't there in the way he had been. The office door stayed closed. However, he stopped coming to the library. Breakfasts were taken back to his desk. And Nora moved through the penthouse with her chin up and her routine intact and her feelings stored in the back room where they belonged. And she was fine. She kept confirming this to herself. Fine, entirely fine. Except for the specific way the library felt wrong in the evenings now, with only one chair occupied, and the way she sometimes set 2 cups out of habit before catching herself, and the way she'd found herself on Wednesday night, standing at the window of her room looking out at the city with the particular ache of someone who had started to feel at home somewhere they weren't supposed to. She called Lily on Thursday. "You sound weird," Lily said, with the unerring accuracy of a younger sibling. "I'm fine." "Nora, I'm genuinely fine, Lily." "Is it the job? Is he—" "Nora, if he's being inappropriate—" "He's not." And she meant it. That was the quiet absurdity of it. The man with the rule, the man who had written no underwear into a contract addendum, was the least inappropriate person she had encountered in New York. He was contained and careful, and he had never once made her feel unsafe. He's just complicated. Complicated how? She looked at the city. Complicated like someone who convinced himself that the ending of the story is already written, she said. On and won't look up long enough to notice it's still being written. Lily was quiet for a moment. "Oh," she said softly. "Nora, don't. I'm not saying anything. You're saying it very loudly without words. I just—" Lily paused. "You drove 400 miles to interview for that job. You didn't have to. You could have done a video call, but you got in the car and drove 400 miles because you decided it mattered before you even knew why. A beat, because you've always known when something is worth showing up for, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's scary." Nora pressed her forehead briefly against the cold glass. "He's my employer," she said. "I know. I have 11 months left on a contract. I know. This is a terrible idea." "Probably," Lily said cheerfully. "Call me tomorrow." Nora exhaled. "Good night, Lily." She hung up. She stood at the window for a long time, the city glittering below, on the penthouse quiet and expensive, and full of the specific silence of 2 people being careful on opposite sides of it. Then she went to bed. She did not come to a decision that night, but something in her, that small, stubborn, hardware store daughter part of her, that drove 400 miles when it mattered, had started asking a question she couldn't put back. What if the ending isn't written yet? What if someone just needs to show him that? It was Marcus who confirmed what she already knew. He came to the penthouse on Friday afternoon for a briefing. Unusual, Marcus generally worked remotely, and found Nora at her workstation with her reading glasses on, and 6 months of donor correspondence reorganized into a system so clean it had apparently made him emotional. "This is beautiful," he said, scrolling through it on his tablet. "Anoin, I might cry." "Please don't." He sat in the chair across from her workstation and looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his. "I am going to say something true and slightly uncomfortable face. He told you to keep your distance," Marcus said. "Not a question." She kept her eyes on her screen. "He's my employer. There's always an appropriate distance." "Nora." She looked up. Marcus had kind eyes. She had noticed this early on, incongruous in a man who operated in Dominic's orbit, where kindness was rarely a professional asset. "He's been alone for a long time," Marcus said quietly. Not just personally, architecturally alone. He builds it that way, and then he's surprised when it works." He paused. "You're the first person in years who didn't leave when he built the wall. You just looked at it and asked him why, and then went and made coffee." She said nothing. "Anon, I'm not telling you what to do," Marcus said. "I'm just telling you what you saw in him. Whatever it is that has you sitting here looking like someone stole the last chapter out of your book." He stood, picking up his tablet. "It's real. It's been real for a while." He straightened his jacket. "He's just scared. And men like Dominic Kane are very, very good at dressing scared up as sensible." He left. Nora sat at her workstation for a long time after he was gone. Outside, the city moved and breathed and went about its indifferent business. Inside, very quietly, something in her stopped being careful. Dearest viewers, he decided the ending before the middle was finished. She heard every word. And now she's standing at a window 40 floors up, asking herself the one question that changes everything. What if the ending isn't written yet? The gala was on a Saturday. Nora knew this because it had been in his calendar for 6 weeks. Hated because she had managed the RSVPs and coordinated with the foundation's events team and confirmed the table arrangements twice and corresponded with the venue about dietary requirements for 14 guests. She knew the guest list by heart. She knew the seating chart. She knew that the Hargrove table was positioned strategically close to the exit because Dominic liked the option of a graceful departure from conversations he found exhausting. She knew all of this with the competent, organized certainty of someone who was very good at her job. What she had not anticipated was the dress. Helena's preferred boutique was on the Upper East Side. Small, quiet, the kind of place with no visible price tags and staff who spoke in measured tones and looked at you like they were solving an equation. Nora had gone on Thursday afternoon with a budget in mind that she suspected was entirely irrelevant to the prices in this particular establishment. The woman who helped her, older, in French with the energy of someone who had dressed important people for decades and had opinions about it, had looked at Nora for approximately 4 seconds and disappeared into the back without asking a single question. She came back with 3 dresses. The first 2 were beautiful, safe, the kind of thing that would read well in a room full of people who wore black tie the way other people wore jeans. The third one stopped Nora's breath. Deep emerald green, floor length. A draped neckline that was elegant without being anything her Sunday school teacher would object to, and a silhouette that did something specific to the way she stood in it. Something that felt strangely less like dressing up and more like being seen clearly for the first time. "That one," the French woman said, with the authority of someone who had already known. Nora looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. She thought about the library, about the storm. What about the candlelight and the sparkling water with lime, and his little finger barely touching hers, and the way he'd said her name in the doorway as if he'd been carrying it. She thought about closed office doors and recalibrated water glasses, and people always do. She bought the dress. She was ready at 6:45. Hair up, loose, a few pieces falling, the kind of arrangement that looked uncontrived because it had taken 40 minutes. The small gold earrings, her grandmother's. Oh, the emerald dress. Simple heels that she could actually walk in Because she was practical even when she caught her own reflection in the window as she passed. Apparently something else tonight as well. She walked into the main foyer at 6:50. Dominic was already there. Black tie, perfectly fitted. Of course it was. Everything the man wore was perfectly fitted. She suspected his tailor was terrified of him. White shirt, white pocket square, the dark watch. He was looking down at his phone with the focused expression he brought to every task, however small. He looked up when he heard her. The phone stayed in his hand, but his attention left it entirely. She watched something move through his expression. Quick, sequential, like weather changing over open water. The first thing was involuntary and obvious, and was gone in under a second. The second thing was more complicated. A kind of recognition, she thought, made the look of someone seeing a thing they had been trying not to see confirmed in high resolution. The third thing was the careful blankness, arriving last. Arriving, she noted, slower than usual. Ready, she said. Yes, he said, and then, as if correcting himself, the car's downstairs. She nodded and walked to the elevator. He fell into step beside her. In the elevator, she watched the floors descend in the panel above the doors and was acutely, much specifically aware of him to her left. The particular warmth of someone standing close in a small space, the faint, clean scent of him, the way he was looking at the doors, with the focused neutrality of a man applying effort to appearing unbothered. You look, he started. The elevator opened. He didn't finish. She walked out into the lobby. The gala was everything she had organized it to be, and nothing she had been prepared for. The venue was extraordinary. A restored Beaux-Arts building in Midtown, its ballroom lit by chandeliers that threw warm, fractured light across 500 people in black tie. The foundation's work was real and serious, and the room was full of people who cared about it, which made it easier to be there. Easier to move through the conversations Marcus had briefed her on. Easier to be professional and competent and present. She was good at it. She had always been good at people, at listening, at remembering, at making someone feel like the conversation they were having was the most interesting one in the room. It was a small-town skill, the hardware store daughter skill of genuine attention, and in a room full of people who were largely attended to rather than attending, it landed differently than she expected. By 9 o'clock, 3 different foundation board members had told Dominic, in her presence, which was its own kind of thing, that she was extraordinary. He had agreed each time, quietly, without performance, with the specific brevity of someone stating a fact they had known for a while. She had felt each one land somewhere in her chest and had concentrated on the middle distance and smiled professionally and moved on. It was near 10 when she found herself briefly alone. Dominic in a necessary conversation with a large donor across the room, a Marcus intercepted by the events coordinator, standing at the edge of the ballroom near the tall windows that overlooked the city. She had a glass of sparkling water. She looked out at the lights. She thought about what Marcus had said. It's real. It's been real for a while. She thought about Lily's voice. You've always known when something is worth showing up for. She thought about her mother's hardware store, and the thin margins in the big box store that had moved in, and the way her mother had not folded, had not retreated, had simply gotten up every morning and opened the doors because that was what you did with things that mattered. She thought about a man who had added a handwritten rule to her contract before she arrived because she had frightened him from a distance. She thought about his little finger, his voice in the doorway. The way the library felt wrong with only one chair occupied. She had come here for Lily. She had stayed for Lily. But somewhere in the past 6 weeks, between the coffee she'd made without being asked, and the storm, and the candlelight, and all the small, careful things he'd done that he would never name, she had also stayed for something else, for the possibility of a man who was more than his walls. And she was standing here in an emerald dress at a black tie gala, thinking about hardware stores and broken-wheeled suitcases and whether the ending was already written, when she heard his voice behind her, low and close, and realized he had crossed the room without her noticing. You've been standing here for 8 minutes, he said. She turned. He was closer than she expected, and the room behind him glittered and hummed with 500 people who were not paying attention to this particular corner. and he was standing in front of her with an expression that was not the careful blankness, not the professional warmth, not any of the managed versions of himself she had cataloged. He looked like he had crossed the room because he couldn't not. "I was thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at him. Really looked. The way she allowed herself to do rarely, taking in the tiredness he usually hid, and the thing behind his eyes that she had no name for, but recognized by now the way you recognize a voice before you see the face. "About whether you actually believe what you said to Marcus," she said, "or whether you just want to." The room noise seemed to recede slightly. He went very still. "You heard that," he said. "I wasn't trying to." She kept her voice even, steady, her mother's daughter, and right to the end. "I came back early and the door was open and I should have walked away and I didn't. I'm sorry for that part." She paused. "I'm not sorry for what I know now. Nora, let me finish." Not sharp, quiet, the tone of someone who had been holding something carefully for too long and was setting it down now, gently on purpose. "You decided I was going to leave, before I unpacked, before you knew me. You looked at the evidence from everyone who came before, and you filed me under the same heading, and you started, carefully, kindly, making sure the ending you expected would happen." She tilted her head. "That's not protecting yourself, Dominic. That's writing the story and then living in it and calling it fate." His jaw was doing the complicated thing. "You have 11 months left on a contract," he said. "You have a family in Ohio. On a life." "I have a family who wants me to be happy," she said. "A sister who told me I've always known when something is worth showing up for." She paused. "A mother who drove 400 miles on her own when she had to and never once called that a sacrifice. It's not that simple." "I know it's not simple." She stepped forward. Just one step, enough to close the professional distance, not enough to be anything other than intentional. "When I know you've been alone long enough, that alone feels like safety. I know Mara left and everyone before her left, and you built something very elaborate to make sure it happened faster so it could hurt less." Her voice was gentle, completely gentle. "I know the rule wasn't about power. I know it was about fear. And I know that it didn't work, and you know it didn't work, and we have both known that for a while now." He was looking at her with an expression that she had never seen on him. Not in the entryway, not in the storm, not in the library doorway, when he'd said her name. Open, undefended, fractionally terrified in the way of someone standing at the edge of something real. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, quietly, almost roughly. "Nothing yet," she said. "I just want you to stop deciding how this ends." She held his gaze. "That's all. Hey, just stop writing the last page. Leave it blank for a while." The chandeliers threw their fractured light. 500 people moved and talked and laughed around them. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the familiar pull of practicality, the small voice that said, "You've said your piece. Now step back. Now protect yourself." And then he did something she didn't expect. He reached out, slowly, deliberately, the way he did everything that mattered. And he tucked the one loose strand of hair that had fallen across her cheek back behind her ear. His fingertips barely grazed her jaw, gone in a second, but his hand stayed near her face for just a moment longer than the gesture required. "I don't know how to leave things blank," he said quietly. "I've never been good at unfinished." "I know," she said. "I'm going to teach you." Something moved across his face then, slow, seismic, the expression of a wall that has been standing for years feeling, for the first time, the possibility of a door. Not a smile. Not yet. But the outline of one. Real this time. Marcus found them 10 minutes later, still standing at the window, not touching, talking quietly about something small. She couldn't remember afterward what it had been. Something about the foundation, something logistical, is something that didn't matter at all. But talking in the way of two people who have just set something large and fragile between them and are moving carefully around it, making sure it doesn't fall. Marcus looked at them, looked at Dominic's expression, looked at Nora's, turned around and walked back the way he came without saying a word. Later, in the car home, the three of them, Marcus in the front, in the city streaming past the windows. Nora looked at her own reflection in the dark glass and felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Not the careful practicality, not the performed steadiness, something lighter. Something that felt cautiously like the beginning of something rather than the management of an ending. Beside her, Dominic was looking out his own window. His hand rested on the seat between them. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked back at the city. She did not move her hand, but she moved it closer, and she felt without looking the exact moment he noticed. She didn't ask him to love her. She asked him to stop deciding she would leave. He tucked her hair back like it was something he'd been wanting to do for a long time. And in the back of a car going home, the same home, their home, for 11 more months, she moved her hand closer, and he noticed. The penthouse was quiet when they got home. Marcus had taken the car on. He lived downtown, and there had been a brief, ordinary exchange at the curb about Monday's schedule. And then he had looked at both of them with the expression of a man who had waited a long time for something and was being very professional about not showing how pleased he was. And then it was just the two of them in the elevator. Rising through the building in the particular silence of people who have said important things and are now living in the space those things have made. The elevator opened. Dominic held the door. She walked through first. The penthouse was the way they'd left it. Helena long gone, the kitchen clean, the city blazing through the windows in its usual indifferent splendor. But it felt different tonight, or she felt different in it. The way a room feels different when you have stopped bracing yourself against it and started simply being inside it. She set her small clutch on the entryway table, the same marble table she had stood beside on her first day, holding page 12, ears burning, the world entirely foreign, and stepped out of her heels and stood in her bare feet on the marble floor. She heard him come in behind her, heard the quiet sound of him setting down his keys, then silence. She turned around. When he had stopped a few feet inside the door, jacket still on, looking at her with the expression she had first seen in the gala window, open, undefended. And this time he wasn't closing it. This time he was letting it stay on his face, which for Dominic Kane was the equivalent of a declaration. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "The addendum." He held her gaze. I told myself it was a filter, a practical mechanism." He paused. "It wasn't? It was a cruelty I dressed up as a policy. And you were gracious enough not to name it that, and you should have." "It was a little cruel," she agreed mildly. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "A little. I survived it." "You did." His voice had gone quieter. "You survived everything I put in your path. Every closed door. Every recalibration." He exhaled slowly. I have spent 9 years building something very efficient and very empty, and I told myself that was wisdom, and that it was the lesson I was supposed to take from the evidence." He looked at her steadily. "And then you came and made coffee without being asked and moved Singapore to 4:30 and sat on the floor in a storm and asked me why like the answer was something you actually wanted to hear." She felt the warmth moving through her chest. Not the cautious warmth of the past weeks, the careful kind she'd been rationing, but something fuller, something that had been waiting to be allowed. "And then," he said, "I heard myself telling Marcus you would leave, and I believed it while I was saying it. And I came to find you at the window tonight, and you were standing there in that dress, looking at the city like you were trying to decide something." He stopped. "And I realized I had spent 6 weeks making sure you would go, and the only thing I actually wanted was for you to stay." The city glittered behind him through the windows. The marble was cool under her bare feet. "And I'm not going anywhere," she said, quietly, simply, the way she said things that were entirely true. "I came here for Lily, but I stay—" She paused. "Let it be precise. Let it be real. I stay for this, for you, for the library and the coffee and the person you are at 11 o'clock in a storm when you're not being careful." She held his gaze. "I stay because you remembered I don't drink whiskey, and you said my name like you'd been carrying it. Rara, and those are small things except that they aren't." He crossed the room. Not quickly. Not with the sudden momentum of someone who had made a dramatic decision. with the deliberate, certain pace of a man who had made a careful one, who had weighed it fully and chosen it fully and was done being afraid of it. He stopped in front of her. Close. Closer than the hallway. Closer than the storm. Closer than any of the almost moments that had been accumulating for weeks like a tide coming in. He raised his hand and cupped her face. Both hands her face held like something he was finally allowing himself to be careful with, and looked at her with an expression that she understood, suddenly, was the real version of him. Not the CEO, not the rules, not the architecture of distance he'd spent a decade perfecting. Just a man who had been alone long enough that he'd stopped remembering it felt like something. I don't know how to do this, or he said. Low, honest, and I haven't. It has been a very long time since I let anything be unfinished, since I let anything simply be. I know, she said. I'll get it wrong. I know that too. You're very calm about this. I'm terrified, she said. I'm just also from Ohio. We don't make a production of Terrified. He laughed. She had never heard him laugh before. Not fully, not unguardedly. It was brief and genuine, and it changed his entire face, opened it up into something younger and surprised by itself. And she felt it land somewhere in her chest and take up permanent residence. Nora, he said, her name again, her name in his voice that was the most careful and deliberate voice she had ever known, saying her name like it was something worth saying correctly. Yes, she said, not as an answer to a question, as a statement, as the conclusion of something that had been building since page 12. He kissed her, gently, unhurried, the way of someone with no performance left in them, no strategy, no management, just the simple, honest fact of it, his hands still cradling her face, her hands finding the lapels of his jacket, the city blazing through 40 floors of glass behind them, and neither of them noticing. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed. She could feel him breathing. I'm going to need you to throw away page 12, she said quietly. A pause. Already done, he said. Last week. She pulled back to look at him. Something in his expression was sheepish, genuinely, humanly sheepish, which on the face of Dominic Kane was so incongruous and so entirely wonderful that she felt the laugh rise in her before she could stop it. Last week, she said. Wednesday. He looked almost pained. After Marcus called, Dominic, she pressed her lips together firmly. You shredded the addendum and then kept the closed-door routine for a full week. I was recalibrating. You were being stubborn. I was being careful. They're the same thing and you know it. She was laughing now properly, the kind that came from somewhere real. And he was looking at her with the expression of a man who had forgotten that this was a thing that could happen in his own home. Laughter. Warmth. The specific joy of someone calling you on your nonsense because they know you well enough to. His hands slid from her face to her shoulders, steadying. Warm. Stay, he said, when the laughter had settled. Quietly, seriously, with all the cards on the table. Not the contract, not the 12 months. Stay because, he paused, found the words. Stay because the library is wrong with only one chair occupied, and the coffee you make without being asked is the only coffee that has tasted like anything in 9 years. Her eyes were doing something she was not entirely in control of. The sparkling water with lime, she said. You remembered that from one passing comment. I remember everything about you, simply without drama, as if this were just a fact he was reporting. I have since the first evening. I told myself it was professional attentiveness. He looked at her with the clear, direct gaze of a man who had stopped dressing things up. It was not professional attentiveness. She exhaled slowly. She thought about her mother, about Lily, about the hardware store on Main Street and the frozen lake in January, and the 400-mile drive, and the broken-wheeled suitcase, and all the small practical building blocks of a life that had led her here. To the marble floor of a penthouse in New York, barefoot in an emerald dress, held by a man who remembered her offhand comments and shredded his own cruel contract clauses and laughed like he'd forgotten he was allowed to. I'll stay, she said. He exhaled, a slow, full release, the sound of something that had been held for a long time being set down. He pulled her in. Not a kiss this time, just held her. His arms around her, her face against the lapel of his jacket, his chin resting lightly on the top of her head, the city outside, the quiet penthouse around them, the candles she'd never lit tonight, which didn't matter because the room was warm anyway. She felt his heartbeat under her cheek, steady, real, present. This, she thought, is what he's like when he isn't being careful. She decided she was going to spend a very long time getting to know this version. 3 weeks later, Nora called her mother. It was a Sunday morning, late, nearly 9, which meant she had slept past sunrise for the first time in months. She was sitting on the kitchen counter in an oversized cream sweater and bare feet, coffee in both hands, the city pink gold and quiet outside the windows. From somewhere in the penthouse, she could hear Dominic on a call, the low measured tones of him navigating something complicated with the Singapore account, which she had been managing for 2 months now, and which had not, contrary to early concern, collapsed. You sound different, her mother said. Nora smiled at her coffee. Good different or bad different? Good. A pause, the knowing kind. Very good. Another pause. Is it that employer of yours? Mama, I'm not asking questions. I'm just noting that my eldest daughter, who has not sounded this rested since she was approximately 11 years old, is calling me on a Sunday morning from New York, and there is someone talking in the background. He's on a call. It's professional. Mama. I didn't say a word. Her mother's voice was warm and smiling in the way that needed no words. Is he good to you? Nora listened to his voice from down the hall, the cadence of it, the precision, and underneath that, the thing she had learned to hear by now, the thing that was only there when he was at home, and when he wasn't being careful. Yes, she said, he's very good to me. Then that's all I need to know. A beat. Bring him to Clover Falls sometime. I'll make the risotto. Nora laughed. How do you know about the risotto? You told me it was his favorite 3 weeks ago, and then pretended you hadn't. She pressed her lips together. I'll talk to you later, Mama. Her mother was still laughing when she hung up. He found her on the kitchen counter when his call ended. Still in the cream sweater, second cup of coffee now, reading something on her tablet with her feet dangling. He stopped in the kitchen doorway in the gray athletic wear, post-run, taking in the picture of her the way he did sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching. The way of someone who still found it slightly remarkable that the thing he was looking at was real and present and not leaving. She looked up. Singapore? She said. On, resolved. He moved to the coffee machine. You rescheduled the quarterly to Thursday? Wednesday, actually. Thursday has the board call and you hate back-to-back Singaporeans and board members in the same afternoon. He looked at her. You hate it, she confirmed. You went monosyllabic for an entire dinner last time. I'm often monosyllabic. Not like that, she turned a page on her tablet. Wednesday is better. I already sent the brief. He poured his coffee. He came and leaned against the counter beside her. Close, his shoulder against hers. The easy, unconscious proximity of people who have stopped performing distance. My mother, she said without looking up from her tablet, wants you to come to Clover Falls. He was quiet for a moment. When? She looked up. He was watching her with the expression she had first seen in the gala window. Open, undefended. Except now it was just his face. His regular face. The walls weren't down because something dramatic had happened. They were down because he had decided, quietly and permanently, to stop building them. Really, she said. I want to see the lake, he said. The one that freezes in January. She stared at him. You remembered that. I remember everything about you. The same tone as before. Reporting a fact. Unhurried. Certain. Nora Calloway sat on the kitchen counter of a 40-floor penthouse in New York City, she in a cream sweater with her bare feet dangling, and looked at the man beside her. The man with the rules and the walls and the handwritten addendum he'd shredded on a Wednesday because he already knew the filter hadn't worked, and felt something settle in her chest so completely and so quietly that it didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like coming home. January then, she said. He nodded. He took a sip of his coffee. His shoulder stayed against hers. Outside, The city moved and breathed in its usual indifferent way, entirely unaware that 40 floors up, in a kitchen with an expensive coffee machine and one apple and a woman who had fixed everything that was broken without being asked, something that had been closed for a very long time had opened. Not with a grand gesture, not with a rule or a contract or a filter, just with two people side by side, choosing to leave the last page blank and write it together. Dearest viewers, how did the ending land for you? Did Dominic's walls come down the way you hoped? Or did you want him to fight harder for her? Tell us what you would have done differently in the comment section. She came for her sister. She stayed for him. He shredded the rule on a Wednesday. And in January, he's going to see the lake. Dearest viewers, hit the subscribe button and stay tuned as we bring you more interesting stories. The end.